I'd like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the land in which I live and work, which are the Yagara and Turrbal and Quandamooka people of Brisbane and North Stradbroke Island. I'd also like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the land in which we are now, the Wandjura people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hands up those people here who, when they're asked what they do, they say they're a science communicator. Hands up those people who are a science communication practitioner. Hands up those who are a science communicator researcher. Hands up those that do both. Excellent. There's one of my myths dispelled. There are plenty of people who do both. I've been calling myself a science communicator for some years now, and when I fill in the immigration form, there's never enough space. But I do, and I'm very proud to be a science communicator. I actually joined CSIRO Tropical Crops and Pastures, as it was then called, 36 years and 56 days ago. That makes me older than most people in the room, so Phil, I actually think you needed to introduce me. I was then replacing a divisional editor, and their job was to help scientists rewrite their papers and disseminate them. But I was called a communication manager, but not yet a science communicator. About 6 years after I'd been at CSIRO, I left and started eConnect Communication. And I think, and I say it, whether it's true or not, that we're the oldest science communication company in Australia, if not the world. They're now a dime a dozen. You've got Science in Public, Science Tell, all those others that came after. But back then, cheap imitations. Back then, it was new and revolutionary. But let's go back to when I joined CSIRO. In the early 90s, the fax machine had just started to be commonly used. It was so exciting. Instead of posting media releases, we could fax them one by one to numbers. How things have changed. We're talking about AI this morning. The jobs that I did back then, I had to write an annual report, which was a glossy publication that promoted what the division of CSIRO did. I had to prepare a biannual research report which had all the science that the scientists had done, summarised, well, not that summarised, and laid out. I learned how to use Ventura software to lay it out. And I was involved in events. Now, in the picture on the left-hand side is chocolate-covered cashews. One of my big successes early on was promoting the launch of the Tropical Agri-Foods program at CSIRO. And to entice journalists to come along, I sent them chocolate-covered cashews in the mail. They loved it. They came along wanting more. In the middle is a picture of a band seeder, which was a machine that one of our scientists had invented to sow pasture grasses into native grasses and hence spread more weeds. I shouldn't say that. And it got lots of coverage. Back then, in the early 90s, it got coverage in national newspapers. Today, it would be lucky to get into the Queensland Country Life. Things have changed. The event that you can see there is Farm Fest. And my colleague Neil Byrne, who also was around CSIRO around the same time, he went to Farm Fest and he saw how exciting it was. We would put up displays and try and drag a few scientists in to have some dialogue with the people that were passing through. As you can see, it was very much one-way communication, mass communication, and simple dialogue happening as well. I also got involved at the time, while at CSIRO, in developing training workshops for scientists with my colleague Tos Gascoigne. And we developed a media skills training course for scientists, a presentation skills training course for scientists, And of all that list, that's the one thing I still do. I mean, they've evolved and they're developed, but that's the one thing that I still do, is to help those people. Very much today, my work has evolved and has become what I'm going to call reflexive, or more reflexive, although I'm still on a journey towards that reflexivity. Earlier this year, I was in the Tiwi Islands, north of Darwin, running a workshop with the rangers on the Tiwi Islands. I was running that with another past refugee of CSIRO, Barbie McCaig, and that's a really important point to make, because I couldn't have run them without her. She has relationships with these people. She works with them on a daily basis. She knows them. She knows what works and what doesn't. I don't. I'm someone from a different culture, different background. I've come in and I don't know what works. We're teaching these rangers to feel confident to speak to their own people about what they do with fire management, feral management, and other things like that. We're also teaching them to use video so that they can take little videos of what they're doing. Now, if I thought this was like a workshop that I run for scientists, it's completely not. We start by getting them to draw pictures on big sheets of paper, and they start to feel more comfortable. The gentleman that you can see at the front there is Stanley. He's really, really shy, and he has to speak to his own clan and to also scientists at fire forums and things like that. He's actually been to 2 of our workshops now, and he regularly speaks to 200 people from 8 different clans. And he said that the workshop gave him confidence. But we had to change everything we did because of their culture, their knowledge, their way of feeling comfortable. So what do I mean by reflexivity? For me, it's about understanding and responding to the contexts and identities of those involved in the science communication process. That includes understanding our own identities in respect to everyone else that is there. It's about scientists being involved. It's about research managers and about the various publics that you're working with. Now, you'll notice I don't use general public. I don't really do a lot of work with general public anymore. I do work with concerned groups, with particular groups of people that I work with. And it is through those smaller groups that I feel like there's change being generated. There was a quote by Melanie Smallman and her co-authors in a book on science communication that Tos Gascoigne helped put together with 39 different countries, that was published by the ANU Press. And in it, you can see that she said that the role has changed from one that explains science to the public to one who helps scientists and technology developers understand society. I don't think it's shifted. I think it's expanded. I think we still have a role to explain, but it has expanded to include that understanding of society as well. Now, I came up with this whole idea of reflexivity when I was writing a paper for the International Science Council with colleagues from the Australian National University, particularly Sujatha Raman. And we were talking about the new science communicator, and we were calling them progressive science communicators, which wasn't too good with the UK election on at the time, because progressive had a certain ring about it. And so we were looking for another word, and people were talking about evolved science communicators. But I don't think we've evolved. We're continually changing and increasing our knowledge. So we came up with the idea of reflexivity in science communication, which, you know, the richness of it lies in its different contexts, disciplines, complexities, characteristics, and with science communication happening in a lot of directions according to the social, political, and cultural motivations. A few years ago, I was also involved in a public communication of science and technology network symposium in Venice. And in a small working group, we were talking about, well, what are the expertise that an expert science communicator needs to have? And we came up with 10 petals that you can see here. And I certainly don't necessarily claim to have all of those petals or anywhere close to being expert in any of them. But I think it shows you the breadth of the roles that we can play. And I'll be coming back to this diagram when I look at various elements of being a reflexive science communicator. Now, in the promotion for this talk, I promised you I would dispel 3 myths. The first one I think we've already dispelled with the hands up at the beginning, and that is that there's a terrible gap between science communication practitioners and science communication researchers. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, the PCST network put on a webinar looking at bridging this gap. I think the gap's a bit of a myth. I think most of you, from what I've heard today and before today, do include research in your practice, and those that are researchers do consider practice in your research. So I think there's a bit of a gap there, and you'll see that in the practice of a science communicator, reflexive science communicator, that gap doesn't exist. Likewise, if you look at the theory of science communication over particularly the last 3 decades, they talk about how bad this one-way communication is, and that we need to get to better, which is this 2-way dialogue communicator. And then the ultimate, the holy grail, is this participatory science communication. My thesis today is that they're all important and they all happen and they rely on each other to a large extent, as you'll see. Now, this is relevant to our session from this morning, and that is that science communicators will be replaced by AI. I think it would be virtually impossible to replace the reflexive science communicator with AI. I'm going to look particularly at research that's needed as part of being a reflexive science communicator, the need to reflect on research and contexts and values, and then how you put that into practice through reflexivity. I'm going to use an example. This is a world that I was thrown into 2.5 years ago in northwestern Saudi Arabia. It is a spectacular landscape, but very different to the landscape and culture that I'm used to. I live by the beach. Yesterday morning I was swimming. This is desert. This has these magnificent sandstone structures. But it is very much a Muslim country. The women wear black, the men wear white, and it is a totalitarian society. It is something completely different to me as a feminist going into this culture. This is the map of where I was working in northwestern Saudi Arabia. There's a town called Alula, and the capital U in the middle is part of how you spell Alula. And what has happened is that they've set up 6 nature reserves in and around this township of Alula. And this is part of the Prince's 2030 vision to bring tourism and high-level tourism to the country. They can see the end of the oil economy and they're looking for other things, and tourism is one of their big drivers, and having that natural environment there is seen to be very important. So there are about 15 villages in or around these 6 nature reserves. They love their animals, their grazing animals, even though they don't need it economically. They still like to go out with their camels and their goats and to graze on the pastures that are there. The Royal Commission of Alula is trying to reintroduce and restore the native vegetation and reintroduce animals like this, the oryx, which has diminished to critical levels in the area. One of the big iconic reasons why they want to do this is that they want to reintroduce this fabulous Arabian leopard. There are about 200 left in the wild, and none of them in Saudi Arabia, mostly in Oman and other places further south. I had the privilege of going to a captive breeding centre in TAFE in Saudi and seeing them, and they're just amazing animals. They really are beautiful. So who were the actors in our project? Who had identities, contexts, and so on that we needed to understand? I mentioned the Prince, who was very much driving this and very much from his perspective. And then there was the Royal Commission of Ulula. We were particularly working with the wildlife and natural heritage people and the human capability development. There were international partners, including a French research team called AFALULA, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, UNESCO, and Panthera, who specialise in big cats all around the world and restoring them back into nature. I mentioned the 15 communities. These are not necessarily poor communities, but they're very conservative communities. And they still follow the traditions of Bedouin tribes that have been handed down through generations. There's the Ulula Township, which is a little bit more upmarket. And then from the villages, we selected 30 nature champions, 15 women, 15 men. And there are 17 teachers from upper primary and lower high school from the communities who are involved as well. And then our team. On the left-hand side is Madeline Stewart, who works for me. You'll notice next to the sheikh, this is one of the sheikhs we met with, is Britt Basil. She's an American sociologist based in Mexico. Next to her is our wonderful local coordinator, interpreter, Shuk Hussain. Without her, she was my voice. She was my voice. And then on the other side is Tos Gascoigne, who was also involved as our token male. There were three things they wanted to get from it. So in the purple, it's all about the community, increasing their awareness and hopefully getting their support for these nature reserves and their protection. Be aware that some of these communities have been shifted forcibly out of where they used to live. All of the communities had their grazing rights affected and their hunting rights affected. They were not very happy. On the right-hand side is the schools and the teachers, improving their knowledge and seeing them to value it. And then down the bottom is this whole idea of these skilled local people, the nature champions, helping to engage communities. And this very much led on from a project that I'm also very proud of in Australia, which was the Climate Champion program that brought together scientists and farmers over a course of 6 years, where relationships between people from the Bureau of Meteorology, for example, and farmers developed into lifelong friendships, and people changed what they did in terms of managing climate risk. So, looking at research, this is where I think you're particularly learning and listening. And for me, the most important skill for a science communicator is listening, because that's what will make you more effective. This is a margilis. This is in a town in Saudi Arabia where they're really angry. There was a time when all the men were up shouting at me like this. I didn't know what they were saying until Shuk, who's standing next to me on the other side, I think she's a bit hidden, she's whispering to me what they're saying. And they were angry because they'd been stopped from grazing in their nature reserve. And not only that, but the wolves had grown in number since the nature reserve had been set up. And the wolves were coming down to eat their goats and sheep, and they were very upset. And that's one of the key things, is to listen to those concerns and acknowledge those concerns as being valid. So all I could do was listen and repeat back to them, and they started to settle down and then say what their concerns and needs are. So we went around to all of the 15 villages and sat and talked, usually with the sheikh and sometimes some other men like here. And in this case, we were also able to have a separate meeting with the women, where they took off all their abayas and their headwear, and they look amazing, I have to say. And they told me that, we asked them, well, who makes the decisions here? And they go, oh, we always have. We always have. And So it was definitely a learning experience. So we found out after all these meetings what their values were and how they identify. So they have this really strong connection with their lands and with their herds. They have a lot of knowledge about that as well. They're really concerned about the young people in their communities. Many of them are moving to the bigger towns, like everywhere in the world, and losing that connection with the land and not having employment. They're concerned about access, really concerned about access to the nature reserves and their grazing rights. They have daily connection with their religion. It is ingrained in them. And for me, it was fascinating to then explore Islam and find out how much of it is about environmental protection. So connecting with that belief in Islam was really important. And while they embrace the modern society, they still had that strong cultural identity and practices. Some of the older people, even though they have houses, still prefer to live in tents. One of the nature champions told me that her grandmother still lives in a tent by the airport, even though they've tried to move her somewhere else. So they have that very strong connection. Our purpose was to find out their perceptions, their concerns. So you can see a couple of quotes here. The first one is about how can I help it if I'm deprived of access? The second one is actually from the rangers, and the rangers are sourced from the local communities, and they say that their communities often have misperceptions. They think that if the camel and sheep don't eat the grass will be covered by sand. So that was a misperception that they have. We also wanted to find out their priorities. So these are 7 of the villages, and you can see that there's a strong interest in community revegetation, in reducing the trash that is just everywhere. They're also interested in tourism and in revegetation and in sharing their knowledge of the reserves. We also wanted to find out their needs, and so we asked the champions what they wanted to learn about. You can see their top one, can we still graze and not have a negative effect on the nature reserve? What are the rules? They didn't know the rules, the implications of the nature reserves. What plants and animals actually need protecting? They didn't know that either. So these are the sorts of things that drove the content part of it. So research was a really important part of what we did. And it was only when we'd done that that we could reflect on it. And you can see here that at this stage we can then interpret it, we can create content, we can start to develop strategies and to be a catalyst for getting people together. So we designed a strategy, we developed content. A really important part of it is to start to develop those relationships, which I think is so important. But also about being adaptive. We hear about adaptive management in ecology, but I think it's also important in science communication. So we came up with a plan and a strategy. The first one up the top you can see is the outreach and communication plan. Lots of one-way communication, not just in direction from the scientists and us as science communicators in terms of information, awareness and knowledge, but also getting their feedback. And then you can see that our engagement and literacy project was very much participatory, dialogue, and connections between all of those groups, which was so important. So that myth, that second myth that it's an evolution, no, it's not. It's happening all the time. They want knowledge. It's not something that we think they should have. It's something they want to have. And so it's about sharing that knowledge and awareness. We developed and adapted these 5 lenses of ecology. And I should use the word co-created here, because this is something we work through, particularly with the nature champions. So we changed the words over time because of their input and their ideas. And even the picture down the bottom changed, in the middle, sorry. Even the picture in the middle, the graphic in the middle changed with their input into what we should have and how we should have it. So, let's have a look at what some of them are. Nature is a strength for all of us. So all about ecosystem services and the fact that we get a lot from nature. Ours is a finite earth. We're going to run out of water resources. Everything must go somewhere. So that whole idea of the natural cycles in life, but also the fact that any waste might be in the environment for quite some time. And everything's connected to everything. So that whole thing of connections. And really importantly, that we're stewards of nature. And we're stewards of God's nature, or Allah for them, because that is how they connect with it. So we trained 30 nature champions over 2-week periods. So I spent probably about 20 weeks in Saudi Arabia over a couple of years. We used scientific expertise all through it. The topics reflected what they wanted to know. So the nature reserves, biodiversity and ecology, conserving water, reducing waste, and then a whole lot on sustainable tourism, plant harvesting, farming, and then a section on communication skills. At the end of it all, we produced these 2 booklets, but this was, again, a process of co-creation. The one on the left is for nature champions, and the one on the right was for the teachers who were doing modules with their students. So we did drafts of these as we were going through them. And we had a pilot book, for example, for the teachers that they then gave us lots of feedback on. And just to give you a little bit of a connection with the AI panel this morning, I actually used AI to produce graphics for the teacher manual. So, for example, we wanted pictures of plants and animals, and so I would feed in a photo and it would produce me a Creative Commons free graphic of that animal. That was pretty good. But then I made the mistake of putting it up. We wanted to do a section on waste, and so I asked it to do waste in the Saudi environment. You know, bottles in the desert, plastic bottles in the desert, all those sorts of things, food waste in the desert. The only trouble is that AI put a Saudi flag in it, and I didn't realise it. And we'd given out the booklets to the nature champions, and the head of our client came and said, "Jenny, you have to get the books and destroy them. You have the Saudi flag with rubbish. That is not allowed." So we had to collect the books up from the nature champions the next day, go and rip those pages out and reprint them overnight. So yes, being aware of some of those very strong cultural sensitivities is really important. This is an example of some of the information that we put in there that was, you know, relevant and important to them. So this is showing the accumulation of microplastics through the environment, its effect on animals that they love and care about, and they do care about the fact that it's unsightly. They probably are less aware of what happens at the soil level, so we also wanted to bring that in as well. We also wanted to get people together with each other to share relationships, and so on the left-hand side you've got we took them to a pilot farm where they're conserving water by using lots of different techniques. And there you've got one of the scientists there talking with the male nature champions. On the right-hand side, you can see women talking with the nursery, the head of the nursery thing. And women have a lot of knowledge about plants, and they were really excited to go to the nursery and see what native plants that they were growing there for ecosystem restoration and for beautifying the Alula landscape. On the left-hand side there, you can see there's a tourist operator working with our nature champions. And we went out for a whole day with a Husak tour group in one of the nature reserves. And as a consequence of that, a lot of the nature champions are now training to be eco-guides, to go hand in hand with the tourism side of things. On the right-hand side, we're out with one of the managers of ecosystem restoration on the Sharan Nature Reserve, and he's talking to the women about how they monitor the climate out there. And so one of the early comments we had when we went out to the villages was that they welcome this exchanging of knowledge because knowledge builds civilization. And so they wanted to exchange knowledge with the scientists. We also looked at monitoring progress throughout. So this is a focus group we had with the male teachers involved in the program, and they told us what they liked about it. They liked the planting, the practical activities. We gave them an opportunity to evaluate their students' progress before and after, and the worksheets. But they had a number of corrections and changes they wanted to make, which we took on board. Once the research and reflection is done, it's all about also being reflexive in the practice. And that's where all the other circles come in. The engager, the negotiator, advocate, and advisor. This requires a level of self-awareness. Notice here, we're in an upmarket marginalist in the town of Haiba, and the sheikh and his fellow people are on one side with Tos, and me and the interpreter and the women are on the other side. This is not usually how I like things. I like things to be equitable. I like to have the mix of the men and the women. But I have to say, not one of those sheikhs disrespected me. They all listened to me. They all wanted to hear what I had to say, and they wanted to ask me questions as well as answer my questions. So I felt an enormous sense of respect. And even though they gravitated to Tos and afterwards, I still felt that during the meetings there was a level of respect. Here you can see that we're out in the oasis of Alula, this beautiful area with date palms everywhere, and a fast falling water table. It's falling 6 metres a year. That's why water conservation is so important. And you'll notice that there's just men there, because one thing we learnt early on is that the women won't speak if the men are there. The men don't care, but the women won't speak. And so we deliberately separated them out and rotated them through exercises so that we could get that conversation going. Here we're in a workshop, and instead of people presenting up the front, we've got 3 women and 3 men, and I'm asking them questions so that we're learning about their knowledge and the context of their knowledge, and they're sharing that with the whole group. And again, here we have the nursery leader talking about, in the glass house, about the process of ecosystem restoration. On the right-hand side, the manager of the National Reserves is answering all their questions. No one way up the front, lots of discussion, hands-on activities. We went out to where they live. So on the left-hand side is the women, and she's showing us how she uses the local plants to create herbs and then to produce tea. In the middle, every time we went to a village, they insisted on killing a goat or a sheep and serving it up on this huge bed of rice. Telling them I was a vegetarian wasn't helpful. I had to nibble the rice at the edges. On the right-hand side is one of our nature champions who's also a beekeeper. And he led 2 of our group up this steep mountain to show how he keeps bees and the tradition of keeping native bees and how important it is. Going out to their context was so important. And using the way they want to learn. They told us they didn't want to have lectures. They wanted to be involved. They wanted to discuss things and share things in their way. So lots of hands-on practical exercises. Here the women are working out how long waste stays in the environment using a timeline in that area. And notice that we're not inside a classroom. As much as possible, we got outside. Part of reflexivity is ongoing learning. So we went back at the end of our project to all the sheikhs and villages that we'd been to, and they'd changed from being really concerned with access and grazing to now wanting partnerships, being involved in sustainable tourism, workshops on native plants, irrigation techniques. So the rhetoric has changed over the 2 years. We found that by ongoing listening. In between each of our training sessions, the champions were asked to go out to the communities and engage with them with what they learnt. They directly engaged with more than 3,500 people in just over a year, because the direct engagement with them was just over a year. So that's a lot of people they've directly engaged with, and they engage with many more through social media. And they also change behaviours and influence others to do so. So I think I've dispelled those 3 myths. You can see the importance of both research and practice for genuine change. You can see that all types of communication is important in all directions. And given the nuances and complexities of being a reflexive science communicator, I can't possibly see how AI can replace it. It's a tool, but it's not something that can replace that human ability to develop relationships, to connect, to understand what people are doing. For me, the most exciting thing about this project was the real change that I did not expect. We interviewed them in May last year, one-on-one, and they said these things without prompting. These are just 5 quotes. The first 3 about trash reduction. First one says, "We now have separated bins. My sister is a teacher, runs the materials that we've given the champions in the school. We taught them how to do a waste audit, for example. They've reduced the amount of times the garbage truck has to come. Mother's happy because the kids don't throw plastic bottles of water anymore." And in terms of water, they're now installing pipes to reduce the amount of water used in the garden rather than just flooding it. And likewise on farms, using drip irrigation, over a third of their farm already. To me, those real changes are what make such a difference. So in conclusion, this happened towards the end of the project. We went out to the nature reserves, firstly with the men and then with the women on separate days. And we put out blankets under the huge sandstone walls, and we told stories about how our lives had changed through the course of the project. And to me, it brings it all together, the importance of research, reflecting, and being reflexive as science communicators. Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Neil, happy birthday. Now I've got the mic.
Happy birthday, Jenny.
Should I do a happy birthday, Marilyn Monroe?
Yes. I've been waiting all my life.
Birthday to you.
That was an absolutely beautiful presentation, and I'm insanely jealous. Not just that bit, but the larger presentation. Could I just go back to your opening comments when you reflected on this whole explosion of little science PR businesses, as I like to call them? Is it true that the reason that Science in Public and Scientel and a whole bunch of our little groups kicked off is because you told us to?
Yeah.
Jenny is essentially responsible for the growth of independent science communication businesses in Australia.
Thanks, Neil. And when I tell people that you're my really good friends, they go, "What? Aren't they competitors?" And I go, "No, I don't do what they do." No, but that's very true. I think we all put our own spin to it. We all have our own strengths, and because I don't do that promotion publicity anymore, I always tell them to go to the best, Science in Public. who really know how to do it. Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Jenny, do you think that you're sort of more research aligned than publicity aligned? So if I'm from CSIRO, so we wouldn't find someone like you in the comms team, we'd find someone like you in the environment research unit with really, obviously you have really deep knowledge of your subject matter. Yeah, can you just comment on that, how it differs?
I love doing practice, but for me, research has always informed my practice. Even when I was writing media releases, I researched how to do it the best possible way. I was relieved to find that you could write it like a news article, and I was a journalist, so that made it easier for me. I love the research, and I get involved in the research, but I think it's really important for informing my practice. But I'm essentially a practitioner. I know what you're saying, and I meet people like that in CSIRO who are not in the communication area, they're in the other area, and in the research area. And I think there needs to be more connection between them. Our team had a sociologist in it. I'm a science communication researcher, and I think those things blended well together in terms of that process. Melina, where's Melina? Melina did research when she was at CSIRO, but you were essentially in comms, weren't you? Yeah, that's because she worked at eConnect before then. So yeah, I think you can do both. And to me, I'm first and foremost a practitioner. Where's Merrin? She'd probably agree with that.
Is that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
My question is, you mentioned you involved 3,500 people. I'm wondering how many people were in each community altogether, and in that 3,500 people, is that just on the ground community members or politicians? So what type of people were involved and how much, I guess, those communities were involved?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. A good percentage of them, yes. The communities vary in size, from being a few hundred to a couple of thousand, but they were pretty small communities. One thing I forgot to mention was that we didn't just research the communities, we also talked to the scientists who were in wildlife and natural heritage. We also did a lot of review, a lot of it was desktop review, into the politics there and understanding what was going on there. It's a totalitarian society. I suspect that we may have been the first people to do proper community consultation in the whole of Saudi Arabia. And we did it by stealth more than anything else. And I hope nobody's taping that.
Can I just, Mark, can we swap over to the holding side? I'm going to do a little swapperoo here. Jenny, I have one last question as we do this swap. I remember when I first started coming to conferences and there was this thing called evaluation. It's like, and you started looking at evaluating your science communication. You realise, actually, if I evaluate it properly, it's going to take 80% of the budget of my science communication. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of practical sense of this reflexivity. How are we going to balance? I mean, it's so easy to just do, I write what I want, squirt it out, and out it goes. How much time is practical, sensible, the minimum that we should spend on reflecting before we start communicating?
That's a really good question. This was a really expensive project. And as the previous questioner, fairly small scale, not mass. So for me, one of the big questions is change is happening at this smaller level. How do we aggregate that to the bigger level? And it's not easy. I think one of the things that we have to do as science communicators and it goes back to that previous question, am I a researcher or a practitioner, is to reposition our role as so that people see what we do as being more valuable, and being able to achieve a lot more than what people often think. I get really annoyed when people separate out communication and engagement and all those things, because to me it's all communication. Engagement is a type of communication. So I think it's about valuing science communication. I mean, the big cost was our time. So if you've already got people and you can support them with their time to help make those things happen, I think it really works.
Thanks, Jenny. That's